Topics today are page speed, site speed, web performance, mostly front-end performance, which is what I'm involved with. Typically using DevTools, which you can just use in the Google Chrome browser or any other Chromium-based browser. And I'll walk you through these topics, and meanwhile, there are some questions here and there, and the faster you answer, the more points you get, but we'll get back to that a bit later. First, I would like to get to know you a bit better. So I would like you to look at your mobile devices. If you didn't join yet, by the way, only 11 people did. You can go to mentai.com and enter the code 54942722. And then I would like to hear a bit more about you people. For example, where you're from. So if you're just joining in, you can grab your mobile devices, go to mentai.com, enter the code. I've got some open questions, no points to be given here, and then some closed, well, yeah, multiple choice questions as well, where you can earn a few points. But it might be interesting to learn where people are from. I'm the only one. Well, I wanted to say I'm the only one from the Netherlands, but I know that's not true, so very good. Mostly from this region, apparently. For the people that just joined in, you can go to mentai.com on your mobile device, and then if you go to mentai.com, enter the code that you can see at the top. And then I've got some questions for you where you can actually earn some points as well. All right, I'm not going to count the amount of people in the room, but 27 people joined, 24 people of those 27 people actually know where they live, apparently. 25, all right, 29 people joined. So for the last one that just joined, you can go to mentai.com and enter the code. Meanwhile, I'll proceed, because I would like to know from you people what your role is, your main role. Is it front-end, more back-end development, maybe marketing, maybe some lost people, I don't know, and other roles. All right, mostly back-end, so this is going to be a tough day for me, a tough session, as I'm mostly talking about front-end performance, but you might still enjoy it, maybe just for the fact of being able to discuss this topic with your front-end developers, for example. How many years of experience do you have? I saw someone being disappointed that I clicked to the next slide a bit too quick, but I'm on a tight schedule, so, and talking about site speed and performance, I have to be a bit quick as well. All right, so good to know, 11 to 19 years is, okay, so quite some dinosaurs in the room, fair enough, cool. All right. My name is, in Dutch, it's pronounced Erwin Hofman, but I'm cool with Erwin Hofman or whatever. I'm a developer as well, still doing some development today, but slowly became a consultant, mostly on the topic of, well, web performance. And I'm typically doing audits, training sessions, in-house training sessions, both at an agency or merchant side, and talks like today. As a matter of fact, 1 week ago, I did a talk at an SEO event, so not really developers, but mostly SEO specialists. And last year, I did a presentation with my wife, by the way, and colleague at the biggest web performance event, conveniently in Amsterdam. But it was the biggest of the world, the biggest front-end web performance event. All right, let's move on to a site spirit intro. For the people that just joined, you can later on, there's a slide, and you can then join as well, because I've got some questions hidden in this presentation. I'm not going to talk about marketing. I'm a developer. I don't really like marketing, but there are a few reasons why you would want to spend time in, well, improving the performance of your website. You can see them here. Again, this session won't be about the marketing side of improving performance. For the people that just joined, you can go to mentai.com and enter the code, and then answer some questions that will follow later on. So back in the days, we had multiple, some of you might still recognize, for example, the page load event or page load metric, DOM content loaded maybe, which are convenient metrics to measure the web performance of a website or web shop. But these metrics are quite technical. They do not really describe anything about someone's actual experience. And that's what it's about in reality. We want to improve the performance, well, the experience of real users. I don't care about lab data tests, for example. So these metrics are too technical, and that's where Google basically came in and they came up with new metrics. That's what I'll be discussing as well. But first, the first question. So are there any people, please raise hands, that want to join but didn't join yet? Because then I'll go one slide back. I don't see any fingers. All right. All right. So you can join by picking a name. If you think you'll be doing a good job today, then use your own name. Otherwise, use the name of your pet or your neighbor or your colleague or whatever. 32 players, all right. Cool, then I'll proceed. And I'll start easy. The faster you answer, the more points you get. Sylius is built on top of which framework? Is it Laravel, Symfony, or Zend? Let's find out who should not be in the room today. All right, phew, good to know. Yes, all right, moving on. Moving on to the next question. Again, the faster you answer, the more points you get. How large was the moon lander software? Was it smaller than an audio cassette, smaller than a floppy disk, smaller than a Doom game, or smaller than an average MP3 song? Let's find out. 5 seconds to go. All right. Not too bad. So the truth is, it was slightly bigger than 660 kilobytes. So the people that voted for 660 kilobytes weren't that far off from the reality. But fun fact, landing on the moon takes less software, basically, less lines of code, etc., than building a website today. As a matter of fact, we can see a clear trend how the amount of kilobytes that we are shipping has grown over time as well. So while the internet speed improved in, well, a lot of countries, we also started, well, we, not specifically the people in this room, but as a community maybe, as web developers, etc., we also started to ship more kilobytes. So yeah, we are benefiting, you would say, from faster internet speed, but with this trend, no one is really benefiting in the end. Third question. So look at your mobile devices. All right, I think we've got the same amount of people joining, so here we go. The faster you answer, the more points you get. What matters for search engine optimization? Is it accelerated mobile pages, core web vitals, lighthouse score, or the page load time or size? This is a question that helps me to better understand the public opinion in the room. Well, if it is working, but not sure why that is not. Let's find out. All right. Talking about site speed and performance. And I do have Wi-Fi, so that should not be the issue. No? All right, there we go. Okay, good to know that no one voted accelerated mobile pages. Who actually knows about accelerated mobile pages? Who has heard of? One finger, just one hand? Okay, a few more, good to know. So it was an attempt of Google to get, you could say, more attention for the site speed topic. But AMP, well, I wouldn't say it's dead nowadays, but it never really became a thing for, well, SEO. Lighthouse score, only 2 votes, that's good to know, because Lighthouse score is a synthetic test. Lighthouse score is not really saying anything about real user experience, so you can use it for technical diagnostics, but the core web vitals is actually measuring real user data. More about that later on. Because first, I would like to know from you people who you typically blame in case of bad web performance. So you can use your mobile devices for the people that joined and use the slider to indicate if you typically blame third parties hosting images framework like Symfony or Sylius or whatever, JavaScript, or developers. Would be surprising, but a lot of people are blaming themselves. I don't know. Third parties, to be expected maybe. But I think we've got a clear image of, talking about images, but a clear picture of Who you typically think is to blame? Obviously, it's always nuanced, but this is giving a good idea. Mostly third parties, developers, well, images at the first place, JavaScript. Let's move on to question number 4. Again, the faster you answer, the more points you get. Here we go. What is the best location for your Google Tag Manager snippet? Is it at the start of the head, at the end of the head, at the end of the body, or does it matter? All right. So why start at the head? I'm going to explain this, obviously. It's a bit nuanced, but everything that is happening in a browser is nuanced, which is keeping me off the streets, which is basically giving me a job. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here if it wouldn't matter. But in this case, if you would put your Google Tag Manager snippet at the end of the head section, then it's very likely that you added it after your style sheet. And in that case, the browser might think, hey, this snippet of JavaScript comes after the style sheet, so it might need something from that style sheet. So the browser will then deliberately wait for the style sheet to be downloaded before proceeding parsing the rest of the source code. So end of the head is not a very convenient location if you want an optimal first user experience. End of body, well, you could choose end of body, but I specifically asked what is the best location for Google Tag Manager. I wasn't talking about site speed in this case. Because if you would add it to the end of your body, you would miss analytics data. People that would bounce at an early stage would never be measured. So your data, your analytics data would be skewed. So the correct answer is basically any blocking scripts, either inline scripts or scripts without an async or defer attribute, should come as high as possible in the source code, ideally after your charge set and viewport meta tags. But before diving into all those metrics, again, you can use your mobile devices here. How familiar are you with each individual metric? For example, if you've never heard of it, well, just keep the slider at 0. If you've heard about the abbreviation, set the slider to 1. If you know what the abbreviation actually means, pick 2. If you even know the thresholds that applies to each individual metric, pick 3. If you know what the differences are between different tests, pick 4, etc. So time to first byte is most well known, not surprising, I guess, because it's also the first important metric that is happening, server response time to first byte. But this is giving us a good idea. IMP, FID is not very familiar. FCP is, but I could try to explain these metrics, but I could also do it with another open question. For example, which one of these do you think are most annoying when you run into them on a website or web shop? So for example, looking at a long white screen or looking at a white screen for a long time, how annoying is that on a scale of 1 to 5? Even if the page is visible, but then the product image takes long to appear, how annoying is that? Or if you click on add to cart, hamburger menu, and the page seems like it's not responding, how frustrating is that? And then finally, maybe ads, videos popping in, sliding down, pushing other contents down. And the general consensus, basically in any talk that I'm doing, is each of them is annoying. And an interesting part is, from a user experience perspective, each of them is a different part of your user experience and user journey. But each of them also correlates with a specific metric. For example, looking at a white screen for a long time is first contentful paint, or a long loading product image while the rest of the page is already visible is largest contentful paint, because typically an image, hero image, product image on a product page is the biggest element on that page above the viewport. Add to cart, or well, clicking on a hamburger menu, whatever, with FAQ maybe, and it takes a long time before the page is even responding. That is IMP, interaction to next paint. And recommended products, etc., is cumulative layout shift, CLS. Mostly metrics, especially IMP, LCP, CLS, are all designed, you could say, researched, and then designed by the Google Chrome team, the performance team of Google Chrome. And then you basically get this summary for each metric. So LCP, the biggest element, which on a privacy page, there typically are not really images aside from the logo, so it's then typically the heading 1 or the paragraph. But on product images and blog posts, it's typically an image. First input delay doesn't really exist anymore, not really being used anymore. CLS, well, I just explained, layout shifts happening on a page. Not just happening above the fold, but even if you scroll to the bottom and some payment icons are popping in and someone did not set width and height attributes, that could also cause a CLS. So basically measured through the full page life cycle and not just until the page load event. First conf paint, we explained that one. Interaction next paint, we explained that one as well. And time first byte, well, you were most familiar with that one already. And these three then became part of Google's so-called core web vitals. So these ones actually matter for SEO as well, so Google ranking. Not other search engines, because it's only Google that is measuring this using Google Chrome. It's submitted to their own data set, and that's how they get to reuse that for ranking purposes. All right, next question for those that joined in. 26 players, okay, we lost a few, although I'm gonna proceed. The question is, what matters most for an image LCP? So when the image is the biggest, what will speed it up? Is it image time to live or caching, or image size, like going from JPEG to WebP, or time first byte of the document? All right, it was a tricky question. So based on public data, both by Google, but also by what we have measured as well, it is in fact the time first byte, which includes server response time. So if the main HTML document, where the image sits in, if that takes a long time to respond, then, well, the browser cannot even detect the image. It doesn't even know that it should start to download an image. And I do get that the image size makes sense. If you're shaving off like 500 kilobytes from an image, it should download faster, right? Well, apparently, based on data, that's not always the case. Which also makes sense when I say, if I'm on a 5 megabyte internet connection and the image is 500 kilobytes, then it should be downloaded quite fast. If I'm shaving off 250 kilobytes because I'm going from JPEG to WebP image format, for example, shaving off 250 kilobytes, the image won't be downloaded much faster because I'm already browsing on a 5 megabyte internet connection. Sure, if your content manager is uploading images of 2 megabytes or 5 megabytes, then it will make a difference, but then you've got other issues, I would say. All right, sixth question. And here we go. The faster you answer, the more points you get. The C in CLS is cumulative. How is CLS tracked? You might have seen this in a previous slide. All shifts across all pages, all shifts until page load, highest per 5-second window, or only above the fold. So Google decided to track all shifts within a page life cycle. So not only until page load, but for the full page life cycle, which makes sense because I, as a user, I don't stop scrolling once the page is loaded. I actually start scrolling once the page is loaded, and it's still part of my experience and user journey. So Google decided we're going to track the CLS, all shifts across the whole page for the full page life cycle. But then single page applications like Next.js, Nuxt, etc., they started to complain, because they don't really have hard navigations when you navigate to a next page. Those are all soft navigations. And those were basically penalized, you could say. And Google said, okay, there's a truth in that, let's change this metric. And they will cap the CLS per 5-second window, and then they will start to track all shifts within a new 5-second window. And the highest value is then submitted to their data set. Question number 7. So, a little spoiler, I talked about IMP before, interaction to next paint, clicking on a hamburger menu, etc. And the question is, what is the biggest IMP risk factor? Which will impact IMP the most? Is it someone's internet speed, someone's device, or someone's location? All right. So here's an interesting part. I already explained how each potential user frustration correlates with a different metric. But some of those metrics also depend on different factors, you could say. So server response time, time for its byte depends on server response time, maybe also someone's location, if you're using a CDN maybe. And the image itself could depend on your internet connection, your internet speed, but the IP depends on a different factor, in this case, someone's device. For example, if I'm not sure how it works at your homes, but if I'm fed up with my mobile device, I typically hand over my mobile device to my parents and I buy a new one. So conclusion, you will always have visitors, maybe visitors of your websites or the websites you are working on, that are using a device generation that is one generation behind. Some might not even be wealthy enough to buy the newest devices, so you will always have visitors that have low-end devices, as it's called. So some of you might have high-end devices, mid-end devices, and low-end devices. As a matter of fact, we did our research together with Google, and they dived into our data sets. And the conclusion was from 1 to 8, that's the device memory, 1 gigabyte, 2 gigabyte, etc. The better someone's device memory, the more, so-called good experiences they have when they click on a hamburger menu, add to cart, etc. Because that's what that's what IP metric is about, and why Google designed this metric. You don't want users to, you don't want them to force to wait for visual feedback when they click on add to cart. You want a pop-up that is saying, successfully added to your cart, you want it to pop up as soon as possible. Same for hamburger menu. Wix websites back in the days, it took 1 second, for example, to open the hamburger menu after clicking on the home hamburger menu. That's not a good experience. So the threshold is 200 milliseconds. That's considered good, anything within 200 milliseconds. And we can see over here, the better someone's device, the more good experience they will have. All right. An open question, so you should then look at your mobile devices. I would like to learn from you people what kind of devices you typically use. Do you typically use maybe, if you use something once per month, pick one. If you use something twice per month, pick twice, etc. If you're even using it multiple times per week, pick 5 on a scale of 1 to 5, which is then giving me a good idea of the tools that are typically used by you, which in this case is PageSpeed Insights and then Lighthouse and DevTools Performance Panel. That's good to know. Not a lot of Google Search Console apparently, but not really surprising because Google Search Console is typically used by search engine optimization specialists, SEO specialists, and even some RUM people. All right. Well, this is giving a good idea. So I don't have to explain a lot in this screenshot. Obviously, I put it next to each other for, so that it would fit in my slides. But at the left, we can see Core Web Vitals data, and at the right, we can see Lighthouse data. And back in the days, when Google just started with Lighthouse, Lighthouse score would be at the top. And they received a lot of complaints from marketing people that were saying, hey, the Lighthouse score is so high that all our stakeholders and even clients, developers, clients, etc., they all think that Lighthouse is important. Google was open for that feedback and they changed the layout. The Lighthouse score was then moved to the bottom and the Core Web Vitals was moved to the top. But you only get Core Web Vitals data if you have a sufficient amount of visitors, which makes sense. If you only have 1 data point, it's not really trustworthy. In this case, a bit of irony here, because HubSpot is writing about how to improve web performance and page speed, but they don't really succeed in doing so themselves. You might have seen the toggle, this, which I highlighted, outlined by red, this URL and origin data. So Google will try to, they collect data from Google Chrome visitors, and if there is a sufficient amount of data, then you will get Core Web Vitals data for that specific URL. For example, a very popular product page. But if that product page was just recently launched, it can't even have a sufficient amount of data, and then Google will fall back to origin data. And that then also matters for SEO purposes. So you also don't just want one specific popular page to have good Core Web Vitals data. but basically across your whole website. But there are, when it comes to Lighthouse, limitations. For example, Lighthouse does not interact. I talked about full page lifecycle, etc., user journey. But Lighthouse just stops at a certain point. It does not scroll, it does not click, while actual users will scroll and will click. So Lighthouse does not represent real user experiences. And you might even have noticed in the past when you did a Lighthouse test, that when you would do a Lighthouse test 1 minute later, you suddenly get a different score, while you did not even change one single line of code. And that's called Lighthouse variability. Basically, summary, the more JavaScript you use, the higher the chance of a varying score when doing another test 1 minute later. Or you get a remark like this on my personal website in this case, that you should shave off 13 kilobytes. No visitor of my website is going to feel the impact, the difference. No one will have a better experience if I spend my development hours on shaving off another 13 kilobytes. So it's basically diagnostics, but it's not like following up Lighthouse recommendations will change or will move the real UX needle. Chances are I'm a Google developer expert. Lighthouse comes from Google. I don't even use Lighthouse anymore since 3 years, because there are too many nuances. Google themselves, Barry Pollard, working at Google Chrome team, performance team more specifically, also basically says over here, yeah, it does not represent real users. And I typically say you might want to use this Lighthouse when you're a technical stakeholder, but non-technical stakeholders should not look at Lighthouse, because Lighthouse won't bring money on the table. That's, well, the real users that are responsible for that. And because of how Lighthouse works, it's also quite easy to basically fake that test. If you would delay all your JavaScript by 5 seconds, it would fall. It would not fall within the Lighthouse test anymore. Lighthouse will not see that, and the end result is you will get a better score, which will get a lot of likes if you would share this on LinkedIn, by the way, because there are still a lot of people that don't know about these nuances. But chances are that if you are ending up faking your score, your real UX won't actually improve. Another screenshot coming from web.dev, basically Google's, Google's documents, all their docs about all, well, not just performance, but also accessibility, for example, where they also are summing up Lighthouse is not a substitute for basically real users, and often does not correlate. Which is where Crux comes in. Chrome User Experience Report. We might not always be aware of this, but when we use Google Chrome, our data is basically sent to Crux. If we, A, are logged into Google Chrome browser, but I typically am because I use Google products like Google Analytics, YouTube, etc. So I'm typically logged in. And B, if you have data syncing enabled, as a lot of people aren't even aware that they have it enabled, then your data, all your experiences are, well, those metrics that I talked about, is being submitted to Crux datasets. They are now tracking 18.6 million websites, meaning 18.6 million websites have a sufficient amount of data to even end up in this dataset. This is, I think, a web shop that I saw in a presentation last year, or maybe at a meetup. Nevertheless, this web shop is parsing Core Web Vitals, and this info is coming from, this is a free tool, by the way. You can also go to this URL and submit your own tool, for example, your own website. And you would get data from the Crux API. It's a free API. It also has historic data. And we then also show it for free because it's a free API. But in this case, it also shows additional information that are not really metric related or UX related. Well, they are UX related. But for example, the type of navigations. And this is quite common on web shops. You people might recognize this behavior if you're on a listing page and you click on a product page. The product page was not what you were looking for. You click back and then scroll, click to another page, maybe click back, etc. So-called pogo sticking. That's back-forward navigations. And browsers actually added a new caching mechanism where they try to cache that behavior, well, cache the exact state of the previous page so that if the user is going back, it would serve that page from the cache. But if you use some specific third parties, for example, or the unload event handler, then you would break this cache and people would not have a instant experience. So the browser is giving us an instant experience. As a matter of fact, this web shop, 15.4% is not coming from back-forward cache, but those are coming from back-forward attempts by the user. So they have more server load than they could have. They could reduce the server load by not blocking these caching mechanisms in browsers. All browsers support this, by the way. Another fun fact about Crux Data is they collaborated with HTTP Archive, and as a result, they can well, see for each website on which platform it is running, and they can do benchmarks like these, where we can see that a lot of platforms actually improved over time. I'm drawing the conclusion that when it comes to time to first byte and CLS, Sylius got a little bit of a hit in the last few months. But aside from that, it's rising above a lot of big platforms, so that's a good sign, meaning the boilerplate is quite good, quite solid. So that's a win. All right, well, some topics I already discussed. For example, Core Web Vitals needs a minimum amount of page views, which I hope makes sense from a data perspective. Otherwise falls back to our origin data, experience across all pages, even pages that do not end up in Google or that were set to no index. The experience on those pages are still submitted to the Crux data set, but it just won't get individual data. And you don't really, well, you would want to optimize for all your users, you know, that brings money to the table. But Google says for some shops, specifically for some audiences, it's undoable. You cannot really optimize for all users when your user base is in Philippines or Venezuela. So Google is saying, we will look at the 75th percentile, basically sorting all experiences, chopping off the worst 25%, and then looking at the last number. And that's what's being reported in Google Search Console, being used for Google ranking, etc. And based on the last 28 days. If you've got a hiccup today or during Black Friday, you've got some issues, then at least it wouldn't suddenly impact your Core Web Vitals data. It's always based on the last 28 days. Not really convenient if you're an agency that is doing multiple deploys within 4 weeks' time, or even if you are not doing deploys, then maybe your marketing team is adding new campaigns, third parties, and then it's hard to pinpoint what has caused the regression. You will not be able to to draw conclusions about, okay, what was causing this regression. Google Search Console data, but, well, I already learned today that you typically don't look at Google Search Console data, so I'll skip this slide. So why DevTools? At least you can scroll, for example, yourselves while doing a performance trace. You can actually behave like a real user. You still maybe don't really know what was causing issues in your Core Web Vitals data, but at least you can test way better than in Lighthouse. When it comes to CLS, we already learned about the 5-second window. If you click on an FAQ, the question pops out. If that takes longer than 500 milliseconds, then Google is basically saying for the CLS metric, this is unexpected. We will report this as a frustrating layout shift, for example. So it's not only above the full CLS that is being measured, all CLS across the whole full page lifecycle, etc., etc. Some causes, client-side rendering is often a cause of layout shifts because content is dynamically rendered, for example, font swapping, or nowadays also missing width and height attributes on images iframes. And if these people are willing to lie, don't trust third parties. Don't always trust third parties when they say, our script is not coming with an impact on your web performance. You might have read this on a lot of websites of third parties, but the opposite is sometimes the case. In this case, I work at a RUM tool, real user monitoring tool. We get data on behalf of a lot of clients that are using our tool. we show them a benchmark as well. How are their third parties behaving compared to other third parties? And we get to sum up all third parties within a specific niche, for example. In this case, cookie consent solutions. And we can then see which you might want to use as a cookie consent solution and which you should stay far away from. Like cookie first in this case, I would say, based on this data, do not use cookie first because it will come with a huge impact on your website towards real users. Same applies to, well, the ones in a moderate bucket, for example, stay away from those as well. Try to limit your choice to the ones in the good bucket. So this is based on a lot of data points. All right, I've got a next question. So look at your mobile devices. A few people dropped out. Maybe they don't feel like winning anymore. All right, there you go. All right, let's continue. What is the best CSS property to animate elements? Is it margin top, padding top, top, or transform? Let's find out. So transform is a bit of an outlier, as in when it comes to the type of answer, but transform is actually correct. There are two CSS properties that you can use where the browser will then offload animations to the GPU, the graphical card, instead of the CPU, which is transform and, I should have made a question out of this, opacity. Those are the only two CSS properties that you can use. Well, you can use all CSS properties, and you can animate all CSS properties. But if you animate properties that are not transform or opacity, the amount of frames will be less, like 30 frames per second instead of 60 frames. So the animation will be less smooth, and the browser will not end up offloading the animation to the graphical card. So it will block the main thread. And the browser is single-threaded. That's a big bottleneck. So never do this. Never set transition to all. If you know which CSS properties you are going to animate, and try to limit it to transform and opacity, explicitly use that property here. Never use transition all. Next question. Consider this JavaScript snippet. So here we go. The snippet will be back on your mobile devices once I start the question, but I'll move back one last time for you to consume this. So I've got an H1 created using JavaScript. I set a bit of text, hello world. I append it to the body, and then I use display none. So let's find out, if I start the question, what is happening here? Will the H1 be visible at the end? No, yes, or only for a split second. And this question allows me to explain what is happening in the browser. So let's move back to the code. The browser is, luckily, not doing any paints in between these lines. The browser will execute all lines of JavaScript code before deciding, okay, I'm now going to do another paint action. Luckily, because otherwise the web would be a slow and shitty place. So in this case, it doesn't really matter if you set style display at the end of just after or just before appending it to the body. The browser will end up executing all lines of code and then do the new render, the paint part. And that's why, in the end, the H1 will never become visible. And that's basically because of how the event loop in the browser works. And I could talk about just this screenshot for half an hour, but I'm not going to do that. You can either maybe just scan the QR code. But in this case, we see two circles at the left-hand side and right-hand side. And at the left-hand side is basically where tasks are queued up. And as long as tasks are queued up, like JavaScript tasks, etc., the browser will first try to get rid of all those tasks. And once there are no tasks in the queue anymore, then that's the moment where the browser decides, okay, and now I'm going to style, layout, and paint new pixels into the screen based on what that JavaScript changed. Like, for example, if I click on the hamburger menu, some JavaScript is going to add a class maybe to the body or whatever div, then that div should become visible. But first, obviously, those lines of JavaScript needs to be executed. And once you know this, once I learned about this, it all made sense how JavaScript can impact performance. It makes sense in general, I guess, that the browser is executing all JavaScript before actually trying to do a style layout and paint action. But once I saw this diagram, you could say it all made sense how JavaScript can be the evil of, well, a lot of things. In that case, this is an IMP. This represents an IMP. It's sometimes my JavaScript, event listeners, like click event listeners, etc., that needs to be executed. But at some unfortunate moments, it can still be a third party, or my own code, by the way, that was still executing at that moment when I try to interact. So then it's still some before JavaScript that is being executed. Then finally my event listeners, or I should say, event listeners of third parties. So if I set event listeners and a third party sets event listeners and another third party does, then it all needs to be executed first before the browser reaches the style, layout, and paint part, which happens at the end. And that's when finally the next frame is being presented. And that's what a real user will feel. A real user, my parents don't know about all this. They don't know what is happening in the browser. They just want instant feedback when they click on hamburger menu. So when would you use DevTools? I first want to know, are there issues? I'm not going to refactor. I'm a developer as well. I want to limit my development time. I'm not going to refactor my whole code base just because a Lighthouse test is saying that maybe some JavaScript is messing up total blocking time. I first want to know, okay, but is this actually also impacting real users? Otherwise, I'm going to refactor for nothing. So I typically first use RUM data, more detailed data than the 28 days data, for example, to really see, okay, what element were people clicking on? And in that case, was it a first party? Because then I can make a change. Or was it a first party? Because then I cannot always make a change, but at least I can tell my client, hey, look at this data. This data is clearly showing that it's your CMP or Hotjar or Clarity or whatever, and you might want to consider using a different third-party alternative, or just live with the fact that it is impacting your performance, but it's not our fault anymore. So you get to blame and shame with proper RUM data, for example, which makes discussions easier as well with your clients or any other stakeholders. As a matter of fact, because we adopted a few Google Chrome APIs, we already ended up on Google I/O events twice in a row, 4 times in total, because of, well, some APIs with which we collaborated with the Google Performance and Google Chrome team, started using their APIs, gave feedback, and then Google said, wow, okay, feedback is valuable. We are going to ship this in Google Chrome stable, for example. So as a RUM tool, we also get to collaborate in that way with the Google Chrome and Google Performance team. So summary, basically, well, a summary about the Lighthouse and Core Web Vitals part is there are huge differences. Even if you pass Lighthouse, you can still fail Core Web Vitals for different reasons as well. But be sure to look at real user data. Core Web Vitals is then a free start. You get the data for free. You do not have to pay for that. Commercial tools are paid if you want more data. But at least, if you haven't started with RUM ever before, then at least Core Web Vitals data is a good start. One example is if you would see very bad time-first bytes in your public data, you still don't know where it's coming from. Within our data, we saw, for example, that a lot of the sites and shops mainly that were using Google Merchant Center, when people would click on a link in search engine result pages, just in Google, Google itself would add a SRSLT ID parameter, and no one knew about this parameter because Google just introduced it last year, and no one added this to their caching rules. No one added this to their server-side caching rules, and the result was a way higher time-first byte of 1.4 seconds. So Black Friday is coming up, so you might want to write this down and maybe hand it over to whoever is responsible for your server-side caching rules. But let's find out first who actually won the quiz. With the last question in mind. All right, congrats, Vaclav. If you want to make a picture, do it now. It's always the most popular part of my presentation. And be sure to grab my cheetah afterwards as well. So thank you. I think my time is up. Yeah, it kind of is. So I don't have time to do live debugging, but just hit me up afterwards. I'm happy to walk through DevTools for a specific web shop. We then at least also don't need to do it in the open, publicly. But I do want to walk through a few, for example, APIs or convenient stuff that we can use today. For example, preloading fonts is something that a lot of platforms are doing out of the box. I also saw it on a Sylius demos, by the way. And I think Sylius is actually preloading variable fonts, which is not very convenient because variable fonts typically already include different font weights. They are typically way heavier than just a regular non-bold font, for example. And if you end up using preloading, it will push back the FCP metric, so you will get a worse FCP metric. So if you end up preloading, Magento, for example, will end up preloading all fonts it finds in the source code. That's not a good practice either. I would limit the amount of preloads to 1 or 2. But again, if you do end up preloading fonts, never preload variable fonts. Try to just pick maximum of 2 and load the variable font later on. I also noticed this on the Sylius demo. Lazy loading was being used already, which is very good, because now we don't need to use JavaScript anymore. Back in the days, we needed to use JavaScript for this, like lazy sizes or whatever library. But this is now already supported by all major browsers for images and iframes. And a bit of a new kid on the block, I would say. You can already create popovers, again, without using JavaScript. And the less JavaScript we get to use, the better the performance will get, if you are not using too many third parties. And there are some other convenient and cool APIs. If you combine these APIs, you are able to basically get a single page application or native app feeling for your non-single page application website. So you don't really need, you can just stick with the Sylius front end if you would apply these APIs, and you don't really need to add a client-side rendered front end on top of it. Also typically worse for technical SEO, but that's a different discussion. For example, speculation rules, you get to prefetch, just fetching the HTML page, or pre-render, render the whole page in an invisible tab. You can achieve this without JavaScript, but with just a few lines of JSON. So be sure to, I include a lot of links with each slide, so you can download and digest that later on. But yeah, you can prefetch and pre-render pages. BF Cache, we already talked about BF Cache. If you want to learn more about this topic, there's a link. And view transitions, or basically transitions when you navigate from a listing page to a product page or whatever page, and you can add a bit of smoothness or maybe even animating the image that someone clicked on to the actual position on a detail page. And it feels like an SPA. It feels like a native app behavior, while it's still just your, well, I wouldn't call it old school website, but still the same backend behind it. All right, I'll be sure to, I had some other DevTools slides, but again, be sure to hit me up later on. And I would say thank you for joining me on this PHP journey.